Today we're learning about the biotic and abiotic influences on an ecosystem. The terms we're talking about are carrying capacity, limiting factors, biotic potential, biotic factors, and abiotic factors. Here we go. When we talk about the biotic and abiotic influences on an ecosystem, biotic means living, abiotic means non-living, and we're talking about the size of a population and how living things and non-living things can increase or decrease the max size of the population. These are called limiting factors, and again, they can be biotic or abiotic, and they restrict how much a population can grow. So a limiting factor is something that can restrict how big a population can be. The max size that we say that a population cannot go beyond is known as carrying capacity. It's the maximum population size that an ecosystem can sustain at a certain point of resources. So if there's a certain amount of food, water, shelter, and space, when it runs out, that is the maximum size a population can be.
Here's a principle of biology. An ecosystem can only support a limited number of species before problems begin happening. So how do scientists determine that number and what things can affect it? Fish and wildlife biologists manage natural resources for the overall health of certain species and the ecosystem where they live. But sometimes a healthy ecosystem gets damaged when too many of a certain species eat all the food. Just imagine a swarm of locusts eating all the vegetation in sight. Once an ecosystem gets that damaged, it can impact the health of everything that lives there. So what's the right balance? Biologists call the right balance the biological carrying capacity. It's the capacity of an ecosystem to carry or support a healthy number of a certain species. For instance, if a forest type supports 2 healthy bears per square mile, what happens if 4 bears try to live there? They may eat all the available food and not find enough to remain healthy. Plus, if they eat all the fruit and nuts, they might damage the next generation of fruit and nut plants in the ecosystem. So what variables can affect the biological carrying capacity of an ecosystem for a certain species?
In order for us to understand what's limiting a population, first what we're going to talk about is what happens when nothing is limiting a population. Well, this is known as the biotic potential. And what the biotic potential is, it's the rate or how quickly a species can reproduce with unlimited conditions. That means it's got unlimited water, food, safety in their habitat. Now, different organisms have different biotic potential. We can reproduce at different rates. People generally can reproduce quite slowly because we only have one child. A rabbit, for example, though, can have a litter of little rabbits, little bunnies, and a cat can have a lot more. So biotic potential is how quickly you can reproduce, and it really varies upon the species that you're talking about. Here's 2 graphs showing carrying capacity. The bottom x-axis is time in both of these graphs, and the y-axis is the number of individuals. And see it first here in this graph as it increases. What you see is you see a slight increase in the growth, and it gets faster and faster and faster, and then it's very steep. At this point, it's at its biotic potential. It's reproducing as fast as it can. But soon what we have is limiting factors slowing it down, and then finally, over time, it reaches what we call the carrying capacity. In reality, though, what you'll see is when we talk about people or any type of organism is we overshoot carrying capacity, and soon there's a limit in resources, and that causes limiting factors to increase, and we go down, and then we increase again, and you kind of wobble on that carrying capacity line. So you go between having too many individuals above carrying capacity, and then that causes the population to collapse a bit, and then it increases again and it collapses again over and over, and it goes through this process. So the biotic and abiotic influences on the ecosystem are the influences that can increase or decrease a population size. A limiting factor can be either biotic or abiotic, and it restricts how much population can grow. Populations cannot grow beyond their carrying capacity, which is the maximum size of species that an ecosystem can sustain. At a certain point, food and water and shelter and space will run out, and this will cause the population to decrease and stay right around that carrying capacity. When we talk about the influences of abiotic factors, we're talking about non-living things like temperature, light, and soil. And we can learn that when we're talking about abiotic factors like light, for example, species can exist when a very specific range of these factors, like sunlight. So if we look at this graph, we have a very little sunlight, and we gradually increase the sunlight until we have lots of sunlight. And we can learn that species like a very specific amount of light so they can reach its biotic potential. If it's too low, it experiences stress, and if it's too high, it experiences stress as well. There's also zones of intolerance, which means it cannot survive in that amount of light, too much light, or it cannot survive in too little light at the lower end. The key abiotic factors for terrestrial ecosystems are light, water, nutrients, and temperature. The key abiotic factors for aquatic ecosystems are a little bit different because it's in water. One is light, nutrients, acidity, temperature, and salinity. So salinity, acidity, and again are added because we're dealing with water. Biotic factors can also influence the size of a population. The ones that we're going to talk about are relationships. You could have competition, predation, mutualism, parasitism, and commensalism. And we're going to talk about all 5.
And after a bit of searching, I finally found it. The clownfish, or anemone fish as it's also called. The beautiful tentacles of the anemone are actually deadly to most fish. The tentacles have stinging organs called nematocysts, which fire tiny darts into fish that brush by. This stinging ability protects anemones from predators and helps them capture prey for food. But how can clownfish hide in such a dangerous place? Well, that's because clownfish have a symbiotic relationship with anemones that is so important that clownfish are almost always found among anemones. Symbiotic relationships are interactions between two species that can benefit either one or both species. Symbiotic relationships are divided up into 3 major categories. Parasitism benefits one species while the other is harmed. Like ticks, for example. There are many examples here in the ocean. Take parasitic fish lice, for example, that cling to a host fish and feed on its body fluids. Amazingly, fish will sometimes find a cleaner fish or a cleaner shrimp to help remove the parasites from their scales, mouth, and gills. When this happens, a mutualistic relationship is formed between the fish and the cleaner organism. Mutualism is a symbiotic relationship in which both species benefit from the relationship. This bird here eats the tick, which benefits the cow. In our fish example, the host fish is clean off its parasites, and the cleaner fish gets a free meal. Both species benefit, but not the sea lice anymore. Hey, I already brushed my teeth today! The third symbiotic relationship is commensalism. Commensalism benefits one organism, but the other one is neither harmed nor helped. You might have had a bug hitchhiking on you at some point without knowing it. An example here in the ocean is when remoras hitch a ride on sharks, big rays, or turtles. The remora attaches itself with a disc on its head and then hitch a ride and feed off the food scraps that the host animal leave behind. So the sharks are not affected by the remoras being there, but the remoras get a free ride and a free meal. Sounds good to me.
In summary, you can have mutualism where both organisms benefit. It's a positive relationship. For example, this alligator here is getting its teeth cleaned by a bird. Now the bird gets a meal and the alligator gets its teeth cleaned. It's surprising that alligator just doesn't chomp down on that bird. Next we have parasitism, and this is a positive relationship for one organism and a negative relationship for the other. For example, a tapeworm. That can have a detrimental impact to your health if you get one. Tapeworm survives in there, is happy, but it could have a negative impact on you. And our last example is commensalism. This is symbiotic relationship like the other 3, but it has a positive relationship for one and no impact on the other. One benefits and the other one is not affected at all. A good example of this is the anemone and the fish, the clownfish. Predator-prey relationships can also impact the size of a population. For example, it has a positive impact on one organism and a negative obviously on the other because it dies. For example, a lion consumes a zebra. That is a predator-prey relationship. A different type of biotic factor is competitive relationships. Organisms can compete for each other for resources such as food or shelter, or even mates if they're from the same species. And they may have negative effects on one another if there's too many organisms in an area. You can have two types: intraspecific, which is between same members of the species, and they can compete over food, water, light, space, safe sites, or mates. It's an important factor in limiting the population size of many species. When there's too many, there's too much intraspecific competition. You can also have interspecific competition, which is between two or more species. You can compete for the same food source that's in limited supply, for example, or as with the population of one species increases, it may limit the population of the competing species. This happens frequently as well. That's it for today's video. Thanks for watching.